Hello, doubtsaloud listeners. Now, we have an interesting episode for you today, one that we've been waiting to get to for quite a while. One for some of you listening out there will think, what the heck is this all about? And others will be itching to hear anything that we might have to say on it. And it's to do with what's called popularly today, the Christ myth theory. And the Christ myth theory is basically the idea put forward that, in fact, right at the back of the whole Jesus story, there wasn't a historical figure. It was another way that this whole thing came about, which we'll go into in detail. So it's very popular on the internet. It's very popular with non-scholars, with highly vocal people out there. It has some scholarly sort of edges to it in certain ways, and we'll be going into that. But we will be just looking overall at the Christ myth theory today. And so maybe Francis, maybe you could say what you know about this subject.
For quite a long time, I was quite happy to dismiss any suggestion of mythicism as just, fringe lunacy. I'm not a mythicist. I'm unpersuaded by mythicism at present. But I do think that just to dismiss it as a lunatic fringe is not warranted. They do raise some interesting questions, I think. And I think those questions deserve consideration and deserve a serious answer.
That would actually be almost what I would say. So we were kind of together
really?
on that one. Yeah, it would be. Yeah.
Okay.
I think that the question, when I first heard it years ago, would have been seen as ridiculous. As my journey has gone on, realizing that so many of the arguments that are used for mythicism are actually drawn from what many mainstream scholars are saying, but they go a whole hog further. But they are actually grounding themselves in the fact that it's pretty much argued that Jesus didn't say or do some of the things it's claimed he said and did. And so you have mythological elements in the Gospels as mainstream accepted stuff. So to me, the question is a valid one to think, how far can one ever go in this question, and where does it lead you, and what stops you, and why is there a consensus and all of that in scholarship that he does exist? All of that does need to be restated, even if it's a restatement. So Ed?
Yeah. I think it's got the reputation of being like the atheist version of young Earth creationists.
Yes, or flat earthism or something.
Yes, it's conspiracy theory stuff.
Yes, that's right.
But like the rest of you, I have warmed up to it a little bit. But still, anything that where all the enormous majority of the scholars who are working in the field reject, then really that question is answered. But still, the material that people are raking over is interesting.
Yes, it's a bit like in biology and evolution. You think, well, hang around, 99% of biologists accept evolution. You'd have to have something really, really strong to go for the 1% that don't.
Yes, it's very similar. Loads of Christians believe in evolution with no problem.
Exactly. Yeah.
Loads of atheists completely accept Jesus existed, no problem. Yeah, then it's a sort of fringe of each. I remember when I sort of was losing my faith and sort of hitting the Westminster College Oxford Library and reading stuff, that G.A. Wells was the bogeyman of people who were saying Jesus never existed, which actually isn't exactly the case. I think he had left a bit of room for a historical figure in there somewhere. And he only recently died. I saw that it's 2017. So
got to say, I've never heard of him.
Yes, he was the known person back then for coming forthright with how so much legend had been applied to Jesus, that he sort of went the full hog, or possibly, and so and that's where it's almost like an edge that you can tip off. You get so much legend going on that you end up coming to the cliff edge going over, and that's how I've seen some of it happen with some sort of very academic people.
And who was the very first? Was it the Victorians? This Kun chap, what was he called?
I think it. I was looking up that, and it was. I think it's certainly 18th century something or other.
18th century.
Yeah.
Wow.
So yeah. So hang on, I've got the actual thing here, and it was going. Yeah, here we go. So it's Constantine Francis de Volney or something. So I need to look a bit more into that. Was first mooting the idea, I think, in the late 18th century. And so therefore arguing that in fact Christianity was an influence of different prior sort of mythical characters all being put together. So this whole thing has been actually done before, and I think my understanding is that scholarship today in the mainstream says we've been here before, we settled it, and now there are a bunch of flies annoying us trying to bring it back again, and that's how I think it's actually seen. And this happens a lot with various views. On the other hand, some people would want to argue a bit like the guy that was against every mainstream scientist on the planet who was mooting plate tectonics back in the day, and no one gave him mocked him, laughed at him, denied it, said there was no evidence, and now it's the mainstream view. So it's
that's the typical conspiracy theorist.
That they use him a lot.
Well, I think that is a good argument to point out that there are some fallacies going on, or people can be almost tipping into fallacy. And the two fallacies that I think are perhaps coming into play are appeal to authority. Just this is what the expert consensus opinion is, therefore it's right, end of. And that's a fallacious use of an appeal to authority. And the other one that's possibly coming in is linked to it, which is the argument to pop, argumentum ad populum is the Latin phrase. You're sort of, although it's not populum in the sense of the wide group of people, it's still, because the large number, the majority believe this, therefore that's it, job done, we can walk away. And both Richard Carrier and Bob Price are very strong on pushing back by referring to the fact that this is is coming down really to a fallacious form of argument, if that's all you've got. I mean, it doesn't obviously cover people like Bart-Erhman, who has a structured argument against mythicism, and is, as everybody knows, strong historicist. But a lot of people will just say, oh, well, it's crazy. Everyone agrees it's crazy. Yeah, let's move on.
Yeah. So there is that difficulty in life, isn't there, between the Alfred Wegener is his name for the guy for plate tectonics, because he's the one example to say, well, look, the mainstream scientists were so stuck in their ways, they needed such strong evidence that was overwhelming, which they eventually got, and then they sort of now he's revered, And so is this one of those, or is this actually like young Earth creationism, which tried to bring back the global flood thing was sort of dismissed in the 17th century as geology was going, and then you're back to the Ken Hams now, who are arguing for global flood in this century and last century, also reviving something that had been settled in with geologists. And so is it back to that? And so the question is, what are we up against here?
I think the issue is that for amateurs, such as, well, I certainly classify myself as amateurs, it's difficult. It's difficult for me to weigh up the arguments put forward by Bob Price and Richard Carrier, and then look at what are said to be the refutations of those arguments from people like Bart-Erhman or others who hold to a historical Jesus, and really come to any meaningful decision. So I do tend to treat it rather like global warming. This is pretty much agreed. Who am I to question the experts? I'm going to accept what the experts say and work on that basis. But I would never try and argue against somebody who denied global warming by just saying, look, all the experts say you've got it wrong. I mean, what I might say is, if you want to ask me why I am taking the view I take, it's because I'm going to follow the scholarly consensus. Okay, you think you've got a different view, that's up to you, buddy. And I can't really comment on it. All I can say is that the smart money generally goes with the scholarly consensus.
Yeah, I do exactly that when it comes to evolution, for example, and biologists and scientists and everything else. And I thought, okay, I'm not going to, why would I, what stake do I have to sort of challenge that? But I also had the opposite experience in my studies for what we've talked about on this podcast on hell, for example, because when I first was doing my research within the theological belief of Christianity and conservative evangelicalism, the eternal conscious torment view of hell was just simply the standard accepted view, and everybody accepted it. And whether they even thought about it or not, it was just, oh, this is what we've been taught, this is what I know, this is what we believe. And all these annoying conditionalists were out there pummeling away with what they were arguing from the biblical text and just getting pushed aside as cultists and fringe believers. And I have experienced being on that end. And so now, of course, things have changed, and you're getting so many heavyweight scholars who argue, like even bart-erhman does, that in fact the Bible does teach against the traditional view of hell, which was the main dominant thing for centuries in theological circles. So I've been on the end of a fringe, what I thought was a fringe movement, but I thought it was right. So isn't it interesting? With evolution, it's the opposite, but with this, it's like, oh, well, I do understand what it's like to be up against a consensus, and I think they don't know what they're talking about. And so, because I've looked into it, and so it's like, oh my gosh. So if a Methodist comes along and sounds a bit like I did on that area, I tend to think, well, I have been there, so I do know what you might feel like, even if I still thought they were wacky. But it depends what subject we're talking about. So Ed, what about you though on these dynamics?
Well, of course, bart-erhman isn't like the one scholar who's very clear on Jesus being a historical figure. He's the one who's dared put his head above the parapet and be a spokesperson for the massive majority view.
Oh yeah, no, I mean, definitely. But I mean, what's remarkable, I suppose, about bart-erhman, I mean, not unique, but that he's so out there on it, and B, that he's an atheist or agnostic. So I mean, I think that's what makes him, from the Christian historicist point of view, such a valuable ally. Because he argues so strongly for it, and he's to the extent he's got any dog in the fight, it's not in arguing historicism. Although that said, of course, he has made his career out of writing books which are based on the assumption that there is a historical Jesus. So it would kind of. So
and he's a popularizer. In the field. It's something he couldn't avoid. Where everyone else saying this is ridiculous, we don't even need to engage. He's feels, I would imagine he feels, because he's a popularizer, that he has to engage with something that's out there in the popular imagination.
And the Conservatives love him on this point because,
of course,
of course they do. But they hate him on the other point, because if you go through half of what he believes Jesus in the Gospels said and did, he doesn't believe masses of what Jesus said and did in the Gospels actually happened as a historical event. A lot of it's made up, a lot of it's adapted, legendary. A lot of it's like, he didn't say that, or almost everything probably in the Gospel of John wasn't said by Jesus, according to Erhman. So, so if you start to press those points to a conservative, they go, well, we don't like him. So Richard Carrier and Erhman would agree so much on what Jesus did and didn't say at one level in the Gospels, but although of course Carrier ultimately would probably say he didn't say any of it because he wasn't there to say it, but at least but I know that when you talk to Richard Carrier about this, he points out he basically is just a good popularizer of mainstream scholarship as well, because he likes to use their arguments to go further with his. But with Q, for example, he loves Mark Goodacre. Richard Carrier does, because if Goodacre is a bona fide scholar who does not believe Q existed, and therefore you've reduced now the two Gospels copying from Mark, And if the Gospel of Mark was actually more written by Roman authors, say, for example, who were using common tropes of mythology and drawing in Old Testament stories and making up the story of Jesus, wow, you've got some ideas to throw around. But conservatives and evangelicals love Mark Goodacre because they don't have to bother with this extra thing that we haven't got called Q. And so they think we've just got the four gospels.
There's a YouTube video of bart-erhman debating Robert Price. And bart-erhman says at the beginning, well, this is interesting because I'm usually there as the kind of left-wing radical challenger, and I'm talking to evangelical students, and I usually start by saying, how many of you believe in Jesus Christ? And woof, every hand goes up. And how many of you are hoping to see me get creamed this evening? And just about every hand goes up. So this is like a real change for me to be the conservative.
He was the conservative finally.
The kind of heart of this, of the Mythism approach, I take is a pagan, not a Jewish myth, that Jesus is the result more of a pagan myth of Mithras or Osiris or something like that, dying and rising gods, all that sort of thing. So is that at all the case? Is there anything we can see of that in the gospel material?
Well, I mean, the essence, if I was to sort of sum up, if somebody said out there, I still don't know what you're talking about, that's all of us here talking about this subject, what is the essence of this Christ myth theory? And I would say that if you just think of it in these terms, that the mainstream view about Jesus is that we have historical, not necessarily Christian, but just the historical view of Jesus, is that you have an historical man born in not born in Bethlehem, but born in where are we talking? I've gone blank on it now. Born in Palestine, we have a historical figure who was eventually over time divinized, became deified. Yeah. And so if you're taking a sort of a secular point of view, I mean, you'd say that this man was a man, and then he became a god in Ehrman did a book on it, isn't it? How Christ became God. Yeah. And that's the trajectory. The Christ myth theory takes it the other way and says what we've got a myth, we've got a belief in a mystical God, heavenly God or deity, and he becomes historicized. So what you've got is you've got things like in prior stories about Roman, there was a very many stories about sort of humans who were deified, but also you had deities that came down to become human and interbred with humans. All this sort of stories have been going on for hundreds of years. And so the mythicists take that idea and talk about that Jesus was a celestial being and end up becoming historicized. Now, what they would do, for example, is take the actual natural agreement about the gospel material. We actually have Paul first, which is a surprise to some, in the 50s and 60s. And then we have the Gospels probably, 70s to 90s, 100 or something like that. And isn't it strange that you have hardly anything in you have more of a celestial being for most part in Paul, and or anything from his death and resurrection and his sort of visions from Jesus, it's all celestial, or a lot of it is. And then we get the details of Christ's human life, which he doesn't seem to mention in the Gospels. And so the mythicists jump on that and say, well, this is the trajectory. We've got a celestial being who eventually becomes historicized, not an earthly being who becomes deified. And so so if I was to sum up that, it would be those two concepts. Do you think, is that a good way to start?
Yeah. Well, okay, but what I'm seeing is that there's almost nothing of these myths
in the Bible.
Yeah. We're so used to this modern scholarship that see it all from a Jewish viewpoint, that we've got this figure, the Messiah gets attached to him, it all goes horribly wrong, and he's got these followers. And where do you go now? Well, you start saying, well, he's still alive after all as a god, and maybe people do have appearance experiences, and it all comes from there. That seems to be a much simpler myth, a way of the myth arising than the mythicists' way of
Well, they would
generating
probably
it.
draw from other more older stories of Roman people. I mean, even if it was not going sort of a deity becoming human, but certainly godlike humans becoming deified suddenly disappeared and were caught up into heaven. And I believe the minimal element of Romulus, for example, the one who is mythologically sort of started Rome, he suddenly disappeared and got caught up to a whirlwind to heaven, and then it was believed by some anyway, mentioned there. In fact, and then came back again to talk and direct and give a prophecy. Now, if you've got those concepts floating around as fabrics in the air, as it were, and then you end up writing the stories of the Gospels, you could see how somebody could make, well, we want to write the story about Jesus like this, and because we've already got those templates in place. So they would argue bigger versions of that, and that's why, I mean, funny enough, Bart-Erhman doesn't believe in the empty tomb anymore. That's a made up invention of Mark, I believe, and that was a new view that he came to. So the empty tomb itself was you know, and we'll go into this a bit later, that there are other stories of empty tombs in the Roman culture.
Well, yeah,
and therefore that's now become less historicized as we go on in mainstream scholarship, funnily enough. And so so some of these old ideas, but it gets very difficult when you have parallelomania. And I think people have overkilled it, saying that Jesus is a rip-off of a prior story. I don't think it's worked like that. But both of you might have more to say on that.
Yeah, it just doesn't work for me. I just can't get my head around it. The idea that people should, who are Jews, this is, because surely it was a mostly Jewish diaspora, if not Jewish Palestine origin, should latch on to all these Roman myths and somehow generate it by kind of mashing together Messiah, which is a very Jewish idea, with all this dying stuff.
I'm with Ed on this one. I mean, to me, the simplest explanation is always going to be the best, and for me, that's the great Achilles heel for the mythicist theory. That it just seems so complicated. I mean, it's like you said, Ed. I can't get my head around it. I mean, I find it so complicated to work out what they are saying is going on.
Yes,
I'm just
because at some stage Jesus is crucified in outer space.
That's right. Yes, in another realm. You know, it's that he was to become a man, but before he could become, I think I've got this right. Before he could become a man, he was halfway between the spiritual realm and our realm, and he got captured and crucified. Something like that. I mean, it's so vastly complicated that I just find it very difficult to get on board with it.
Yeah, I mean, it's easy to see, even in one sense, from a Jewish point of view, that Jesus was, you know, they thought he was the Messiah, but then he died, and then they still thought he was the Messiah. And so the death then became something very important and was meant to happen rather than a shock to the system, you know, and that's been a common way of looking at it, that they had to come to terms with who they thought the Messiah wasn't going to die, but then he did. And then they sort of rework everything from that point of view. But if you think about it from the point of view of very little of what Paul says about Jesus, and then you say that the details of his historicity in terms of mass story is actually first written by Mark, who isn't a Jew, and is, you know, and different people have different views on where it was written and who wrote it, but somebody far off, if you can find arguments to say that masses of Mark was actually just literary copies and rewrites of Old Testament stories and maybe Roman tropes, you start to then worry about how historical this person is in many aspects. And that's where the sympathy I have comes in, because it goes, okay, so Jesus didn't feed the 5,000. So what happened then? Well, that's a copy from the Old Testament of that feeding, and maybe there was a Roman story like it, for argument's sake, and they just filled in Jesus' gaps. Because, I mean, you know, what information did the author of Mark have? Where did he get it from? And so he didn't get much from Paul. So
let's be a bit clear on this.
Yeah.
So how many of the miracles in Mark, like feeding the 5,000, have parallels in, say, Elisha and Elijah stories and that kind of thing? Is it most or all?
Well, it's a good.
I mean,
the book that really impressed me most on something like this was the one I gave you, I think, wasn't it? It was Gospel Fictions from Randel Helms, who's a literary scholar rather than the biblical one, but he looked at the texts based on lots of other writings of the Old Testament, plus a mixture. It was a mixture of Roman writings and Old Testament ones. And it's unbelievable when you read the book put together. I found it very, very persuasive in many ways, not totally, but in many ways. I thought this is a shock to the system, because the way I was brought up as an evangelical was that all of this was almost like video camera reality. If you could go back in a video in Aramaic, what was being said and done, it would be pretty much what we read. Actually, it looks like stories of many of the healings were complete rewrites of Elisha with certain twists on them. And so many of the words in the Septuagint were the same, and so many of the phrases were similar. I thought, oh my gosh, there's something literary going on here, and not. And when you go to literary, you go away from literal, as far as I can see. It's very, very difficult. Then when you get people say that, oh, Jesus is the new Moses, and so the whole thing about going to Egypt didn't actually happen because it's just a literary device to make him, and
well, to me, that's just obvious.
Well, there we go.
And
so,
and Matthew is so clunky the way he does it.
So I'm so in one sense, what it breeds is a little bit of Christ mythicism in little nuggets. So Christ didn't go to Egypt. Oh, I see. So that's a myth then. Okay. So and then you say, well, Christ didn't feed the 5,000. So that's a story that's a rewrite about him. And then you think, okay, so did Jesus then cleanse the temple, or did he do this, or did he do that? Then it raises the question, did he have the conversation with Pilate in John, that great big long one where he doesn't at all in Mark, because he says to be silent? And you think, okay, so that didn't happen. So in one sense, all of us are a little bit Christ mythicists in stories of certain. You would be, Francis, wouldn't you, with certain stories?
Oh yeah. Oh yes, definitely.
So the question is ultimately, what are the reasons to say we cannot go all the way? And I suppose that's the way I would do it. And I would say, no, I don't think we can go all the way because of these other reasons. And but you can certainly go further than I ever thought.
I mean, Bob Price, his big point is, when you strip away all that away, what are you left with? Nothing. You've got nothing other than the things that the failures, or the things that, that's right, that you can see are reworkings of previous stories.
It's where the Christ of history, even if you're in the mainstream, the Christ of history isn't the Christ of faith, as some people once put it. And so you've got a myth. Everybody's a myth. Well, not everybody, but all the mainstream scholars are mythicists to a degree in certain elements, and that's where it gets really, really muddy. Because it would be nice to say, no, everything Jesus did and said is what we read. We'll harmonize the contradictions, and it was all Jewish, and it all happened, and that's what I was brought up like, to be honest. And so once you get into scholarship and you realize that a good deal didn't happen, particularly say in the Gospel of John, you saying, okay, right, so this came from this might have paralleled something in the Roman culture, this might have paralleled an Old Testament story. It doesn't seem to be written by eyewitnesses. How oral tradition seems to be wobbly anyway. And so, yes, you're stripped back to someone who probably wouldn't recognize himself if Jesus came back now. I mean, the historical one. If he turned up now and you'd read about him, he'd say, when did I become the Trinity? Gosh.
And another way of looking at it is to have a kind of view of life where it's either a cock-up or a conspiracy, in which is more likely. So the conspiracy people would say, they needed to control this movement, and so they made up a historical figure to lend bogus authority to what they were saying, and that kind of stuff. So that would be the mythicist relying on a conspiracy basis. And I'm always thinking cock-up's more
cock-up is generally more likely. But I think for Richard Carrier, and I assume the same for Bob Price, it's not, I don't think they say that there was a deliberate conspiracy creation of the myth. They say there was just this, this honest belief going on about something that was a myth, and it sort of segued into gradually over time into historicism. And the extent to which I see Carrier as supporting a conspiracy was where they say the reason you can't find any contemporary documents saying that Jesus was a celestial figure and not a human was because they were suppressed. that as the church took over, they suppressed anything that would have indicated that there was quite a widespread belief. He suggests, or he's perhaps he doesn't put it as strong as that. What he says, I think, is, for all we know, there could have been a very widespread belief with lots of documents supporting it, saying that Jesus was a celestial figure who died in the outer realm. But anything that was that clearly undermining of the historical figure of Jesus would have been suppressed by the church. So it's an argument from silence, and it's a bad argument from silence, because we know that the church did destroy certain documents, and therefore we shouldn't draw any conclusions from the lack of documentary evidence.
There is it's a bit, in one sense, it's not quite as bad as that, because if you think about 95% of what Paul says and the book of Hebrews, Jesus is really he is somebody that's died and rose again. It's the crucifixion, but basically he's doing everything from the heavenlies with Paul, and also in the book of Hebrews, it's all what he does in the heavenlies. It's just like he really is up there somewhere doing something for the world, enacting and whatever, until sort of the end of the age, it seems to me. And so he, it's very much up there rather than down here. It's only when we get to the Gospels, and maybe there's about 5 or 6 statements of Paul that you can ground him down into the planet. And so even we've discussed this in this podcast, isn't it? What does it mean? Even Ehrman says it is actually a puzzling question. Why doesn't Paul stress the humanity of Jesus and all that he did? Demon possession, expulsion, and stories, and Pilate, and none of that. And so en masse. And so it does raise the question that if the Gospels weren't ever written and all we had in the church was Paul, where would we be with this question? Because you'd say we don't know anything about it. Born of a woman, and even that's a strange sentence, because what does that mean? I mean, because it's a strange thing.
Too much.
If I say I was born of a woman, I think you'd think I was mad. Because you think, well, where else were you born?
Why did it need to be said?
Why did it need to be said?
But he does talk about James, the brother of Jesus.
Yeah, that's
that's on the other.
With Paul, that's the big linchpin point, and it's a valid point, very strong one.
And all the other stuff in Galatians of sort of going to Jerusalem and checking all this out and all that sort of stuff. Yeah,
it would be. I mean, I suppose Paul's interaction with Jesus was still a vision himself, and it looks like, matter of fact, we argue that, don't we, when we talk about the tomb stuff? It's like actually Paul throws himself in there as one of the people that saw Jesus, and actually Paul talks about it as a vision. And does that mean all the others were visions? And so all of this after ascension interaction with Jesus is actually from the heavenlies. And so Damascus Road and everything else. And so you are dealing with, even the book of Revelation is a sort of revelation meant to be from Jesus coming down to some human on earth. And so in one sense, this whole stuff about, there's so much more in the Bible than we think about Jesus not being on earth and from the heavenlies, that it's a point to take into consideration. But the gospel, and then it all comes down to the Gospels. If everything's sourcing from, there's no Q, everything's sourcing from Mark, and Mark is mainly literary, a literary artist who's making a story about Jesus, even thinking perhaps he was historical. So much of it is fabricated. We wonder what is left. Who was the Jesus that was there? Can
we pitch in with something that's a bit new?
Yes.
Just particularly for any listeners who this is such old ground.
Yes.
Robyn Walsh has written a book that was featured with her in her interview with Mark Goodacre on the recent NT Pod.
Yeah.
We've all been talking about it amongst ourselves, and it does seem to add new weight to the discussion.
I think it does. Yes.
Now, Andrew and I's take on this is that Mark, as in the gospel author, not Mark Goodacre, is seen by Robyn as picking up on his Roman background in telling this Jewish story. And so, and the example that was mentioned in the discussion on the NT pod, which of course we'll link to, was the empty tomb narrative, which Mark is the first person to mention in history. And and Robyn Walsh points out how that is a trope. If you want to talk about someone who's a bit special, what you do is you have a story of people discovering their tomb is empty.
That's right. Who's become, say, a supernatural element to them, or a god, or some level of deification as well.
That's
which
that's
was
supposedly how you signify that they became a god.
Yes, and so you have some version of an empty tomb story, which is maybe why some other scholars don't think the empty tomb is something you should really push. I mean, Paul didn't even mention it himself. So
yes, it's fallen out of the minimal facts.
It has fallen out of the minimal facts, and it's interesting that, because that's a relatively new thing that I've seen in my own generation. But this book, it was really interesting because we talked off air about this, and Francis, your take was slightly different than mine.
Yes, I think I have a problem at the moment not having read the book, and I suspect I won't be reading it.
That's not a problem for me. I haven't read the book.
It costs like £45.
That's right. I was going to say the Kindle edition is £43.19. Hardcover is £67.50. So
I better get two hardcovers then.
I suspect I shan't be reading this book.
Yes.
I picked up rather more that her emphasis was the other way around, if you get my meaning. That I picked up that she was saying was that it wasn't that Christianity used non-Christian literary devices, it was that non-Christians spotted the Christian stories and thought, oh, that's good, that's a good way of putting things. Yeah, if you want to show somebody's become a god, you show that people went to their tomb and the tomb was empty, and that's how you signify that somebody's become a god. So I took her as saying that a lot of non-Christians borrowed from the Christians to insert that into their stories. But I'm interested to hear from any listeners who have got the book, any listeners with 68 quid odd to spend, and if you want to have a look at the book and email us, then and because you either agree with me or disagree with me, I'd be interested to hear.
I think not many people have the book as yet. I mean, I'm going on the podcast with Mark Goodacre of the NT pod for the last episode and some of the reviews. I did listen to that, and it didn't, I have to say, it just didn't nail it for me as to exactly what she was saying.
It was quite a short section on the empty tomb.
It was, yes.
And that was the only time when they actually got down to nitty-gritty.
Some details.
Well, there was also some talk about, was it Satyricon and the Last Supper, that somebody makes us, I mean, I can't now remember all the details, but what would be interesting would be if we could get hold of the specific stories apart from Satyricon, which I guess I can look up myself. Somebody called Telachio or something. I'm terrible with names, so I would have to go back and listen to the podcast again. And
but Andrew, you said you were listening to Bob Price on this years ago.
Yes, that's what really now really made the link for me, and also I've gone back to this Robyn Walsh because I knew this subject was coming up, but I was so fascinated by it. I've listened to the NT pod on this 4 times right the way through on the way to work. Yeah, because I was just because sometimes I was get sort of tune out and think about something else and I wasn't following it, so I thought I've got to go back and make sure I hear everything. And my take from it after listening to it four times, and today was the 4th time I listened to it, my take was definitely trying to get to because it was complicated and it wasn't that easy to understand what they were talking about. But my feeling was that she was basically having a thesis that she was so surprised at reading so many certainly with the empty tomb side. I think she's got 30 illustrations of empty tomb stories. and she talked about resurrected people, that she thought, why hasn't anyone pointed out these parallels before, or making something of them, or seeing is there some kind of connection? And then her bigger thesis around that is that it may be the community that people have assumed wrote the Gospel of Mark, and the Gospels weren't, particularly Mark, I think, were actually Roman authors, as opposed to even Christian people, that they were doing their let's do the Jesus story. Yeah. So it's like asking J.K. Rowling, say, okay, here's a story of a Jewish thing. We've got a little bit of information. Can you do a whole story? And then they take all these current things floating around and make a really great story. And that's the impression I got. It was that direction. So it's really interesting, Francis, that you saw it the other way. So I will have to listen to it 5 times and see if I can see if I can make the direction the other way around. Because I thought she was saying that, because Mark's response was saying that everything was oral tradition and everything's going back to trying to get a nugget of what may have been originally said. And he's saying, actually, the authors are just literary authors who aren't really thinking about historicity. They are writing a story. And therefore they are the creators of the story. And so what you have, so the thesis is that it's the creation of the story takes common themes in the Roman culture and blends it with the Jewish story. And that's what I got from her. So it's like,
okay, well,
yeah.
When you've listened to it again, let me know. And if you can give me some timestamps so I can go back
myself.
Okay.
Yes, go and listen to
re-listen, because I've got to say, I wasn't, it took me a long time even to kind of formulate a general overview of what I thought she was saying, and I was still a bit confused even at the end of that.
But the point that you said, Ed, was that it reminded me 15 years ago when I was listening to, this was probably, where are we now? So it was about 2006 that when Bob Price was started doing a sort of podcast stuff, and I heard about him. I found a YouTube clip a little bit later, and because he'd mentioned it on the podcast, and then I think the YouTube clip came out where he was reading all these Roman stuff, and it doesn't necessarily mean they were before the Jesus story, but certainly were written in the sort of surrounding decades. So it could have been after. So one might say, well, if it's after, then it's copied. But he was reading these stories that really had nothing to do with Christianity at all. They weren't. But what was funny was the empty tomb, and they rushed to the tomb, and their body wasn't there. And it's like, oh my gosh, this is really interesting. And then when she's mentioned it, it just drew me right back to what he was saying, and he was making that this is something that shouldn't be ignored. In the popular. Maybe we've got things today that people talk about in a certain way, and if we wrote a story, you'd say, well, I see it in films sometimes, and I say, oh, that's the same ending as that. It's in the the series Ashes to Ashes on telly had the same ending as Lost, basically, and it's like, oh my gosh, there's similar things going around. Or
I know, both rubbish, weren't they?
Yes. Well, no, I liked Ashes to Ashes and Life on Mars.
I like Life. I like Life on Mars.
Life on Mars, yeah.
Ashes to Ashes was a letdown.
They were trying to continue the story, and it ended up in a sort of an afterlife situation, which is what Lost did. But when you think about these themes, you think, gosh, that's who copied who, or maybe it wasn't. Maybe just these ideas were floating around in current endings ideas, and suddenly they say, well, let's write it like this, and let's write it like that. So that's the influence I got from that podcast. And the reason it's interesting is because she is an academic looking at the evidence, and I think her heart is, I get excited about finding out about what might be true, or more true than we've known, and why has scholarship gone this way and not that way. And she's not, I don't think she's letting theology get in the way of where the evidence might go. And I always like that. I always would like to be that myself, but it's difficult, isn't it? So that's that book.
Okay. Well, here's another author who we all probably have an opinion on because he's so well known, Josephus.
Yes.
And he's interesting because he is the only voice, even vaguely contemporary to Jesus, who is not a Christian, whose words we supposedly have that nails Jesus as a historical character.
No pun intended.
Oh gosh. Oh dear.
Oops, sorry.
Oops.
You're slipping in the crucifixion there, Ed.
So yes, I think I think the problems with Josephus are well known, aren't they? That he was clearly tampered with, and having tampered with him to achieve the end of supporting the Jesus story, the Christians have actually ended up scoring an own goal, because it's now open to people to argue, well, it's probably even more tampered with than, why should we believe any of this account? Why not just say that the whole thing is, the whole of Josephus' account is an interpolation by devout Christians who thought somebody writing at this time should mention Jesus. So let's make sure they do.
Yeah.
Yes. Yes, it's quite telling that he's doing all this history, and Jesus is at best gets 2 or 3 sentences.
Yeah, and it's obviously Josephus says he's a wonder worker and a miracle worker, and you know that Josephus isn't even a Christian, and he's saying all this stuff. So it seems to be kind of obvious that a large section isn't him, and it's a bit worrying when people forget to mention that.
It's easy to see Luke in it. Look, someone's got a copy
yeah,
of Luke's
that's
Gospel.
gaining more popularity now. Actually, at first, again, that was another subject that people poo-pooed, but now there seems to be more people coming on board with Luke being an influence there, and which is really interesting, particularly on dating Luke as well. The Book of Acts, you mean, or?
I can't remember.
Isn't
it the words of the disciples on the road to Emmaus, the sort of unnamed minor disciples?
It's something
from them?
like that. Although some people have it the other way around as well, that Luke was using Josephus.
Right.
Yes, and so again, you have anything that has a relationship. People are on either side on which direction it was. A bit like what we were talking about.
Yeah, sure.
And so anything that's sort of linked, and this is the problem with it, with these parallels. You think who's conservatives are generally, if anything's later than the Gospels, they go, you see, these writers are copying from Christianity. They're very happy with that, but do not sit well if Christianity ever copied from someone else, like the flood stories, for example, or some of the New Testament stories in the Old Testament seem to be copying the Old Testament and rewriting them, and they don't like that either. So in many ways,
I kind of backs to the wall of people who agree that Jesus probably did exist as a real historical figure. Well, what actually can we say about him that we kind of know, not 100%, but sort of 95, 98% sure that this is a fact about Jesus that we can be happy about? And in our search for that, maybe we should start with Paul, because Paul is the only source we have that we can kind of trust, really. That's how I feel. That Paul is so much dirty laundry in his letters that you can't imagine anybody would make it up.
And you don't mean the 7 letters that
so he's a real figure. Yeah, we got the 7 letters that people are pretty sure of, and that's with good reason. And like Galatians is one I always like, because it's so full of spats and stuff that people wouldn't invent it as a Christian holy text. So we're sort of on solid ground when we're using Paul, but as we've already said, there's so little material in there that relates to the actual historical Jesus. So here's my list from Paul. The Last Supper is something he mentions, and he uses this formula of how he kind of he was told about. Paul was told about it. This is in 1 Corinthians, I think 11 or 9, something like that.
Yeah.
And he was betrayed because of Paul introduces it as on the night he was betrayed. They have this supper, and they have some words that are pretty similar to the communion words in the Gospels, actually closest to Luke. So we got that. We've got Jesus teaching a couple of things. He was not keen on divorce, and I think it was something like preachers being paid, that the workers due his wages or something. I forgot, something like that. He has that's again in 1 Corinthians. In Galatians, we've got that Jesus had a brother called James. We know from Paul also that Jesus had a poor and humble lifestyle. He wasn't a kind of high and mighty rich in a palace. He was a that sort of thing. And then, of course, that he was crucified, and that soon after his death, people had experiences they called appearances.
Yes.
And anything else you'd like to add, or any of those that you think I'm going too far?
No, I think that's where it all comes. Yeah, Francis, you're going to go on that.
No, I don't think so. I was just, resurrection appearances. I think we agree that, I don't know if we could say it's known, but I think we tend to agree that people believed they'd seen Jesus.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah. I mean, without that, I don't know how we understand the whole thing.
Yeah, no, that's fair enough.
It's got to have a life after the death of Jesus somehow, and that would explain it.
Yeah. So what you mean? Those minimal.
The Christian movement.
Yeah. The Christian movement needs something to. The belief to at least the belief that something happened to propel it as it did.
Yeah.
So something happened. So
yes.
And that sort of thing. So that grounds that even though it's very a paucity really in one sense, it is enough to ground you with something.
Yeah.
To build from, and be interesting to if somebody wanted to look at some of those elements and think, well, okay.
Okay, so surely we can add to that list, because we've got all those four gospels of material rather than the odd aside in Paul. Yes,
and that's where it does get tricky based on, for example, if are you going to have Q as an independent thing going on or not? And obviously Q is the mainstream view, and non-Q is not, but there's still scholarly debate on it. Is the others, the synoptics, copying and plagiarizing from Mark and adapting and embellishing? How much of Mark is the question, is going back to accurate history? And where did the stories come from? And which Paul didn't unfortunately mention a lot of it, most of it. So did he assume it? Did he not know it? Did he have a reason to say it's not really important? And yet the gospel writers are writing it because it is important. So there's questions.
This is one of my things. Do you remember I had that long discussion with John at the London discussion group?
Yes.
With blogs under Jono's Tippling Philosopher, that we had a lovely exchange
on that.
So that would be some material I'd like to sort of get into a bit more deeply.
Which was Mark, because Mark is the one that interests you most, isn't it?
Well, what was the focus there was, why on earth does Paul say so little about Jesus? And I was trying to. Yeah. John was sort of in his way. This is John Nelson saying, kind of nothing to see here, move along. Yeah. Which is sort of how N.T. Wright talks about it. Yeah. And I'm saying, no, there is an issue here. This is a scratch your head.
It is
strange thing that needs explanation.
And it is, people have different responses. And of course, I would like to, or somebody should have gone up to Paul when he was writing and say, please put a lot more history in there, because Christ mythicists will come about and bother us. Because you're not giving much. You're giving everything from the resurrection onwards and nothing much behind.
Yeah. So can I leave it just as a taster for us to pick up in another episode?
Yeah, another whole subject. What does it mean that Paul didn't really mention much when he could have mentioned so much? And what did he know?
Yeah.
The question is you can't really answer that he knew it, but you could just have an idea, say he knew it all, but there's no reason to mention it in his occasional letters, or he didn't know much, and maybe
or there may be missing letters. It may be that there are letters
missing
of Paul that just went missing.
If
Robyn mentioned it in those.
If Robyn Walsh's thesis comes to anything and it moves in that direction, then you have Roman writers making up much more than we ever thought in the Gospel of Mark, therefore bypassing. But maybe they had Paul. Somebody's going to say, we've got some Paul's letters. He's given us about 5% of this guy, so we're going to now fabricate the rest. Who knows? I mean, if scholarship moves that way, if it's all down to me, I think Mark is the most interesting, because if the others are copying and John is completely rewriting, and Mark was largely fiction, if it was in many ways, then you've got some problems for the future. If it goes that way, you want to ground Mark much more historically than maybe it might go. Well,
we've got these criteria of authenticity.
Yeah.
And I think the classic one in terms of something that the criteria supposedly had nailed down for us, sorry about saying that again, is that Jesus was baptized by John the Baptist.
Yep.
Because it's embarrassing, it's multiply attested.
Right, yes.
And all that sort of stuff.
Yeah.
So, I mean, is that something we're pretty confident did happen?
Yes, I think the arguments on it are pretty sound.
Yeah, I mean, there's talk of that Jesus was probably part of the group of John the Baptist, and that even though we don't have it like outlined like that there was a breakaway and something, some people argue that behind the text of the New Testament was something going on with John the Baptist being the original group and everything else, and yet suddenly Jesus rose up above that and had a different group, and there was this sort of interaction between the Gospels of their different groups, wasn't there? And so you could say that's so embarrassing, that connection, and a matter of fact, one of the Gospels has to put John down a bit, doesn't he? He may be the I forget what the phrase was now, but sort of putting John down in his place. I think one of the phrases was about him at the place in the kingdom or something for someone like John. Again, I need to go back and check that.
So is it anything else to add to this list I'm trying to make?
What that would ground you in some sort of historicity?
Something about Jesus that we can know pretty well for sure. Yeah,
I think, I mean, the crucifixion itself, obviously there was crucifixions were happening all the time, and so the story of him causing a disturbance, say, and then ended up being crucified by the Romans is a very, very natural thing that would have happened to someone who was causing a disturbance. And so that lends plausibility to historicity right there. It's not something crazy that's being spoken about. And so that's why the majority of people say that he did exist and was crucified, even if we don't go much further. And, as some sort of guy that was saying a bit too much in the wrong place, threatening the kingship of the as it said, and therefore the blame later being put onto Jews is it's argued as well. And it was the Jewish thing grew, the anti-Jewish thing about the Jews being responsible was a growing in the telling, as opposed to right at the beginning it was a Roman thing going on. So that's where the core of historicity, I think, comes in for me.
Yeah. Do you think Jesus being thought to perform healings sort of in his day is something we can say?
No, I don't.
Okay.
I think that might be, yes. I mean, probably, but I think it's not something that you can be really confident.
It's something that does get added to people.
No, it gets added to people all the time, and there were lots of stories, and this is where you do have parallels that were all over the place of other healers. Even in the Bible, there's other healers going on. They put them over to the dark side, and so the famous only a few decades later, I believe, there was Apollonius of Tyana, who was a healer and doing all the same sort of thing in the background there. A few decades later, maybe 40 years later, but then they became a rival group and had his own believers and followers, and so according to the the stories about Apollonius of Tyana, and that's full of healing miracles and things. So I understand. So I don't think that gives much credence. I tend to worry more about historicity when I get stories like that.
And how about Jesus' teachings? Is there anything in there that we can know for sure that he said, or not word for word, but was from him? Well,
this is the problem. I think everybody in the mainstream scholarship who's a bona fide so-called scholar all agree that Jesus didn't say some things that he's purported to say. But the problem is they do disagree on what that is in many cases. And so it's almost a probability. You might get one that says, oh no, he probably said this. Like you just look at James Tabor and Bart-erhman. They both would say different things about what Jesus did or didn't say, and so there's things that you think, okay, he's really unlikely to have said that, and it looks like it's likely he could have said that in the context. And so all of us probably have to trust a range of experts on that one, unless you want to believe he said everything he purported to say. Francis, on that one?
Sorry, were you talking to me?
Yeah, I was just saying, what do you think about the different things of what you've read about what Jesus said and didn't say? That it's purported that he said, but he didn't really say it or do it. Is there anything that comes to mind?
Well, I don't think he probably didn't say that the person who is without sin can't cast the first stone, but then that's all to do with a story that we think is an addition. I think I don't know what you think about this, and maybe it's too off the main track, and I don't, so you can shut me down or you can cut it out at editing if you like. But it's interesting that Paul has this reference to eating flesh and drinking blood, given that Paul was a devout Jew, and you would think that this would be so shocking to Jews, the idea that you would eat human flesh or drink human blood, that it does make me wonder, well, was that said? Why was it said? Is there any explanation as to how Paul could come to accept that? I don't know. I don't know if I'm taking us off on a
no, because this is very much part of the whole thing that leads to those little nuggets of mythicism that I've talked about, where in certain, if you're not saying Jesus said something, many people, as far as I can understand, argue that did come from the Roman culture, where they did have things like that going on, and therefore that's the Roman side of things coming in, because it's so un-Jewish.
But why would, so do you think that was because Paul was also a Roman citizen? Okay.
Well, James Table argues the reverse of what most scholars argue. I've got a book when he argues that actually this will probably shock you, Ed, as well in this, but James Table argues that in fact it came from Paul, and that he thinks that Mark, whoever wrote Mark, built upon what Paul said and made that story, rather than Paul was remembering some sort of passed down story of the Last Supper and sort of quoting it. And that's not because, I just want it to reverse. It's because he feels it's so non-Jewish. And even the
he's just talking about the Last Supper words, not the whole of Mark's Gospel.
Oh no! He's talking about that nugget or pericope or whatever you call it.
Yeah, I know. Yes, that's right.
It comes really from Paul's Roman side, blending it in there. That's his theory. Now, of course, a lot of people disagree with that and think, oh no, it was original Jewish story. But the thing is, he brings in an argument like the Didache has a thing about the Last Supper, and it misses out all the elements that Paul has, and it has a different meaning. And he thought that was the original Jewish thing, and what Paul introduced was a new thing, which was what you picked up, Francis, was the shocking thing, because a Jew would have just been shocked at this concept, and suddenly Paul's mentioning it as if it's just straight from Jesus at the Last Supper with no problem, and books and books have been written on this, and I don't mean the whole Gospel of Mark. No, I mean that story. So again, scholars are, James Table's a proper scholar, and he has that view, and so it's interesting.
But it's odd that it's Luke's, much closer to Luke's words.
I think
the word of Luke.
And then Luke,
what I'm trying to say,
got Mark anyway, and so it's all incestuous, isn't it? So it's like but Luke's not Jewish
Mark
either.
Is different, much more different to what Paul reports than Luke is.
Right, I see what you mean. Yes, so maybe I have to go back to James Table's book. Maybe he means Luke's rewriting of Mark was taken from Paul or something in his mind. Because of course Luke is not a Jew either, and so matter of fact, we don't. No, Luke is just the name, as far as I'm concerned, rather than the person that's in the Book of Acts. And so, who is this? All these mysterious authors cause us a big headache because we don't know who they were, what was behind what they were doing. So anyway,
right. Okay, we've got a bit of time left, so can we take a turn to a slightly different twist here?
Yeah,
and that is more talking to our kind of typical evangelical friends. Sorry, I sound like a pompous
atheist.
Talking about my skeptical friends or something.
Yeah.
Anyway, so the discussion on that we often hear from apologists is that all these secular Bible scholars like probably Mark Goodacre is a Christian and bart-erhman isn't, but
yes,
that they're going where they are because they don't like the miraculous element in the Gospels. They feel the weight of the modern age to be skeptical about everything. People, and particularly the point that they aren't skeptical about Roman history, and all this. We can hardly say anything about Jesus is only applied to Jesus, and other figures in antiquity don't get that same mean skeptical treatment.
right.
So is that something you've heard?
You mean other figures don't get the same, so it's not being fair?
Yes, that's right. There's some
Right.
unfairness. So everyone is saying we don't know anything about all these classical scholars in Jesus scholarship are trying to debunk Jesus when they don't debunk
Right.
Seneca or
Well,
whatever.
Yeah, that is a very common apologetic response.
I think it's slightly unfair the other way around, because I've seen it the other way, where people will defend all the miracles in the Bible and dismiss all the ones with everyone else, and so they are not being fair either to the situation, because when you've got was it Caesar Augustus, who's called the Son of God and has this, and there's a star or something that comes up when he's born. That's just common language for son of God. A lot of Roman people were called sons of God. Very common. That's another thing, by the way. It is very much a Roman thing, the Son of God. And all of this is like not true, didn't happen. It's all mythology. And then the Bible, no, we've got historical reality here. Star of Bethlehem and everything, And so, mind you, not the mainstream scholars probably wouldn't think that, but I think that you get it the other way around. That actually, Jesus is treated not like other people in many ways, because he's given the benefit of the doubt, whereas other people are doubted in certain areas. Do you see what I mean? So I'm sort of just turning the whole thing on its head. In other ways, you could say, if you don't doubt half the stuff or a lot of stuff that Plato wrote, or if you don't doubt some of these other things, then you aren't being fair. Because you need to sort of come at everybody with the same criteria, and that's what I think bart-erhman feels he does with everything. You come with the same criteria. You don't have a divine writing from anybody, and to treat the Bible so special is causing a problem as well, if you see what I mean. So you could say you're not being fair, but the Bible is being treated as so special. It's the one exception that you can't challenge in some ways. And so I feel that balances up sometimes this idea that everyone's having to go at the Bible or Jesus, because they've already set themselves up as so special that perhaps they need to be taken down a little more.
Can I talk about something that struck me where scholars in ancient history, modern scholars of ancient history, are really saying, look, despite what everyone's saying, that we just don't believe the sources we have. And that's something that comes up a lot if you listen to In Our Time, which I'm quite a fan of. Now, this is a BBC Radio 4 program with Melvyn Bragg, and it's been going for years and years and years. 20 years at least, maybe. And they do, it's mostly history of ideas, but there's kind of events in history and all sorts as well. And whenever you get something, particularly on the ancient world, it's clear pretty quickly that people are talking about stories rather than events. So they're not quite sure how much of these stories happened. And I've picked out one that struck me especially, and that is something that's pretty contemporary with Jesus, happening in about the 40s and 50s AD. Mm-hmm. And this lady called Agrippina the Younger. So this is In Our Time, and the 31st of March 2016, if you want to look it up. And of course, we will link to that. Now, this lady was Nero's mum and the fourth and last wife of the preceding emperor Claudius, and so she was extremely prominent in contrast to Jesus, who was sort of in a backwater of the empire and hardly well, as we say, wasn't talked about at the time at all, except by his followers. And she even wrote her own memoirs, which Tacitus had available to him. But we don't have them. But we do have accounts by Tacitus, who's a sort of proper, full-on Roman historian, Suetonius, and someone called Cassius Dio, who I haven't heard of. So what's nice is that Tacitus and Suetonius pretty well wrote the same number of decades after the life of this lady that our gospel writers wrote after the life of Jesus, just slightly longer, but only a decade or so. So there's a lot of kind of parallels in one way, but lack of parallels in the other, in that Agrippina was a very prominent, well-known person. What I want to do is play out an extract from this episode of In Our Time. And I want to give a little bit of background first before I switch it on. So we've had a discussion of the third wife of Emperor Claudius, the one before Agrippina. She is called Messalina. And they had been talking earlier on in the episode about her behaving like a prostitute while married to the emperor, and how scandalous this was and all the rest of it. And then just before the extra I'm going to play, they were talking about Agrippina again as working on behalf of her son Nero, who was kind of teenage at the time, and basically poisoning Claudius, her husband, and to clear the path for Nero to be the new emperor, who wasn't, of course, the son of Claudius, but her son. So in this discussion, a guest has confirmed that the sources are pretty well unanimous on the fact that it was Claudius who was Agrippina, who was responsible for the poisoning of Claudius. So let's give it a go. And here is them discussing all this.
It doesn't seem much doubt, though, or you said that she did away with Claudius.
Yes.
She poisoned him.
The sources are pretty unanimous on this. Josephus and Philostratus cast a little doubt.
Why did she do that?
Else. Well, the moment seems to be right for it. It's October 54. Claudius, let us remember, is 64 years old. It's been a hot summer. He might just have died of natural causes of fever, but all the sources suggest it was poisoning. So in 53, Agrippina and Nero's star had been pretty high. Nero was named as a successor when Claudius fell ill temporarily. It looks like Nero's going to inherit.
So she does poison him, we think. So Catherine, yes. Nero takes over. He is the emperor in waiting. She's manoeuvred him ahead of Claudius's real son, Britannicus, named after this place. And so...
Well, that's true. I mean, we have to remember there's a 3-year age difference between Nero and Britannicus. So Nero is only 16, Britannicus is only 13. So Nero is kind of a more plausible candidate to succeed Claudius at this point. I mean, I do think we need to be quite sceptical about the stories of poisoning. We find similar stories told about Livia in relation to Augustus, and it is very much a trope of the manipulative, evil emperor's wife who is scheming to get her son into power because, of course, it was Livia's son.
I mean, do you believe them, or do you think... I'm intrigued. I've read all this stuff. It's terrifically exciting. It's very operatic, very dark, very what it is, sort of Game of Thrones-ish, except plus. Right. Do you believe it?
I don't think I do believe it, to be honest. But I think it is. It becomes a kind of running theme.
So Messalina wasn't a prostitute, and
well, I don't believe Messalina was a prostitute either. I think that's another way in which one can these aristocratic male writers make sense of women in public. They've got to have found their way there by some evil means or other.
So none of it's true. So what we've been talking about is just a lot of bosh.
I think it represents the stories that were circulating at the time, and those in themselves are interesting because they give us an insight into how people...
But you have proof that the proof is not right.
I don't have proof, of course not.
Fascinating. Wow.
So much for being multiply attested then. Is that is that what we get from that?
That's one of the things for sure.
Yeah, so how are you tying this in then? All the
sources are pretty unanimous on this. That's what they said about Agrippina poisoning her husband.
Yeah.
And I actually looked up myself the sources on this other lady, Melusina, being behaving like a prostitute. She had a competition with real prostitutes, and she outdid them, according to all of this. And that kind of stuff, and her reputation as like that is also attested in the same three sources, which is all we have about her as well. So they're saying that all the sources agree. It's not, it's multiply tested. It's not like one of them is against that, and we're deciding on that voice. No, they're all the sources we have in history about it. The experts are dismissing.
Yeah, so that raises the question on even agreement and the sources. If the origins can still be that they're doubting even the story based on, well, what was it? She said something quite like, "Oh, that was a common themes of the day," which is exactly what we're talking about.
She said the same word, trope.
Which is what
Robyn Walsh said.
Was what Walsh said. They were tropes of the day, and we're using our common tropes to talk about something, to say, okay, so the prostitution thing in this story wasn't like he's a bit like a fundamentalist critic. It's just a load of bosh, but actually themes and tropes could be trying to say something even if it didn't happen. And i.e.
Melvin's behaving like us.
Yes,
he's
it's a load
doesn't
of tosh,
want all this nuance. He just wants to know, did it happen?
Yes, did it happen or did it not? But historians don't sort of quite work like that. They say, well, look, people want to talk about truths. Plato does it. He talks about truths with stories rather than just saying this happened. He may be doing a story where something didn't happen, but it means an awful lot in why he's saying it and how he's saying it. And I suppose that's more the progressive liberal approach to stuff, isn't it?
Yeah.
But it is interesting. I can see how your ears itch there. Yeah.
Yeah. The other big thing that comes from this is that why they reject it. And it's not just that it's not believable that the emperor's wife should be behaving like a prostitute like that. It's that we can see why the sources would be making that sort of stuff up, or would be latching on to the stories given that were circulating and reporting them with a reasonable amount of confidence. And that is basically that they talk about it a lot in the episode, men not liking the idea of women having power and influence.
The reasons to write are all part of what we've got in history, isn't it? And so it's not just tropes, but your motives. We get that in the New Testament, though. You could say
that's right. That's where I'm coming from.
The idea with Paul's letters, or the pseudo Paul's letters, with coming down on women being able to speak and everything else. There's reasons to try and shape Paul that way, because they've got reasons that they're probably going the Roman way again. That's another reason, by the way. The household had the male head, and Dale Martin goes into this, that you've got these reasons why the pastorals would have been written with agendas in the background. They're not just saying this is what's happening and we're just neutral. Nobody's neutral. Yeah. You're not going.
I'm going slightly differently. I'm saying that the gospel writers, I assume that they are Christians, and they're Christian documents trying to aid the church, that they have a massive bias that Jesus was someone special and all the rest of it.
Right, yeah.
So that's why they would report with such confidence stuff that they shouldn't have had confidence in, because it was just hearsay or whatever they got hold of it. So this is sort of talking about Agrippina's character and her fellow Melusina's character, and did she do a poisoning, which is sort of slightly, it's something that's going to be under the radar by its very nature. But there are facts about her as well, which people have completely dismissed, and it's all good fun. It's how she died. So Nero eventually got the hump against her, and he assassinated her. So that's agreed. But right. How it happened, there's these stories of this self-sinking boat that Nero or his henchmen kind of got designed and made to to get her killed. And Melvin likes it and he tries to talk about it, but the other guests have got no time for it at all. It's just sort of a fun story. They've got better things to talk about. So I did look it up, and it's great fun. Because this supposed boat, the first story from as given by Tacitus, it had they had this boat and it had a lead ceiling. So can you imagine a boat with a lead ceiling? It would sort of be upside down as soon as you try to float it. Anyway, it had a lead ceiling, and at the right time they made it collapse on her, and she survived. It only hit a sofa or something.
Yeah.
But someone outside somehow got crushed by it. I don't know how that works. It's just, it seems just implausible and doesn't hang together and it's ridiculous. Anyway, the boat failed to sink, even from this lead ceiling thing, and so the crew had to sink the boat because they were in on this. But Agrippina swam to the shore, and then later on, when Nero found out, he got people to assassinate her. So that's a Tacitus story. Suetonius has a collapsing ceiling, but it's not on the boat. It's in her own home in the palace that they did this lead ceiling, but which she survived. But then they had a collapsible boat as well, and it had to be rammed. So that was something different. And then the third author, who's much later, has a different version, and that is the ship has a special opening bottom, so that it opens up and you'll fall through. But again, it didn't kill her, and she had to be assassinated. And they had a famous final words she said that no one else knows about. So what I'm saying from all this is that the historians completely dismiss this, got no time for it at all, not because it's miraculous, but because it's fantastical.
If I was an apologist, I'd say, well, there's no contradiction here. I mean, she could have had a lead ceiling at her home and a lead ceiling on the boat. And, the fact that it was collapsible and to be rammed, well, that's completely consistent with it opening at the bottom. That was how it was collapsible. It would open at the bottom if another ship rammed it. That's what I'd be arguing. If I were
if it was part of a divine book that you knew was inspired by God, you would have to go that route. But when it's outside, you can say, well, there's just these different stories, and
that's right.
They both seem implausible. So it's like, So I mean, this implausibility. This is the problem, isn't it? That all this implausibility happens everywhere you look, and makes the Bible seem like, well, it's also got implausible stuff, and why not? Because people write implausible stuff all the time, including, by the way, all the books not in the Bible that were written a bit later and later after that, making up stuff which everyone agrees is just made up.
Yes. Yeah.
So it's like, like, it's crazy, isn't it? You can get these books, they say all this stuff about Jesus as a child. Well, it's just made up. They just made it up because they wanted to fill in the gaps. And you're thinking, well, why do you protect? It's theology that makes you protect the Bible from going there, you defend it with all this harmonization and all this sort of rationalization. As soon as you get to, the Gospel of James, boom, Christian was just having a bit of fantasy time. Yeah. Fan fiction, as you like to call it, Francis.
That's me. Yeah.
Yeah. Yeah. And the Gospels probably are fan fiction.
Walking on water.
Yeah.
Walking on water is a bit weird, isn't it? Along with making clay sparrows and breathing life into them. Ascending up and disappearing behind a cloud with two angels telling you where he's gone and when he's coming back is a bit implausible to me. Because if you found that in one of these, the Gospel of, Judas or something, you would say, like they do about the Gospel of Peter when it talks about the giant cross and the coming out. They go, oh, you see what I mean? No wonder it's not in the Bible. And yet at the same minute, you've got Jesus ascending up behind a cloud in the Bible, and it's perfect videography history, and that's the difference. You jump from one extreme to the other based on 40 years. One is completely made up nonsense, and the other is completely plausible history to defend. And so that's where I have a problem, and that's why I think it's unfair the Bible's treated like that, because it's theology, not history.
It's special pleading.
Pleading. In your case, this is the one where Jesus did ascend and go behind a cloud, you get Romulus caught up in a whirlwind and say, what a load of nonsense. Or Tosh, as that guy would say. What did he call it?
Melvin.
Bosh.
Bosh.
Okay, so you say, so if you ask a historian, did Romulus, well, first of all, if he existed, and then if you say, did he get caught up from the wall into a whirlwind, into heaven, and then come back down again? You say, well, that was the tropes of the day. No, I don't think it happened. And everyone will be happy with that. Yeah? Everyone would be happy with that. If you started to say, no, I think Romulus was caught up and he came back to give a prophecy to one of his people that were following him, you would start to be a bit worried. But not when you talk about Jesus. So then it's like totally credible down in Oxford, you know, and it's like, wow, what a difference. You know, so anyway, that's the way my mind thinks.
Yeah. So Jesus existed.
Yes.
But there's not a whole lot more we can say.
Francis, any ending comments on mythicism?
No, I'm pretty much in, you know, where you guys are, I think. So nothing to add.
On that. Okay, and Ed, what would be your final comments on it?
Well, I guess a lesson to us all that we have to be aware how manipulatable we all are, and this is back to the most recent point of how the armchair mythicists seem to be as conspiracy-minded as flat earthers and young earth creationists.
Yes.
That we must all be aware that we're humans and susceptible to these cognitive flaws that we all have.
Well, I think we've touched into this subject of Christ mythicism enough for people that have been interested in what we've been saying, trying to get a handle on it, or just being into it already and want to sort of comment. Please email in to give your comments on it and where you are and how you've heard of it. And hopefully some of the things that we've said will be food for thought on this subject of Christ mythicism. So until next time with another interesting subject, I have been your host, Andrew.
And I've been Francis.
And I've been Ed. Thanks. Goodbye.